Have you ever stopped to think that behind a society as seemingly calm and disciplined as Japan's, there might be dark, twisted stories straight out of a nightmare? From the 1960s to the 1980s, Japan saw the rise of a vibrant pop culture, but it also witnessed the birth of deep fears, fueled by the rise of underground manga, the growing otaku subculture, and a full-blown moral panic that spread through the streets. The case of Tsutomu Miyazaki, nicknamed the Otaku Killer, was the breaking point that exposed the cracks in this seemingly perfect society. Get ready. Over the next few minutes, you'll dive into a true story involving child abductions, anonymous letters, youth violence, and disturbing fantasies that shook Japan to its core. Only those who stay until the end will fully understand how pop culture, fetishism, and devastating family trauma merged into crimes that are almost impossible to believe. To Japan in the 60s to 80s, it felt like a pressure cooker about to blow. While the country was booming after the war, young people were starting to rebel, big time. Radical political movements were springing up in universities, and youth culture was exploding in new forms of expression, like underground manga, a style that kicked traditional censorship to the curb. In the raw, gritty pages of those comics, many young people poured out their frustration, fears, and yes, twisted fantasies. This was also the era when social deformity finally found a voice. Underground manga embraced taboo topics like extreme violence, sexual perversion, and isolation, echoing emotions most people only dared to feel in silence. Instead of hiding their pain, these artists laid it all bare in intense, often grotesque stories. To give you an idea, it was like each panel was a muffled scream against a suffocating society. Today's fans of stories like Lone Wolf and Cub or Devilman might have no clue just how heavy and raw the roots of that movement really were. But of course, every intense shift comes with a backlash. By the time the 80s rolled in, Japan found itself in the grip of a full-blown moral panic, stoked by the media and conservative voices. Suddenly, underground manga, once a release valve for the misfits, was being blamed as a dangerous threat. Was this graphic, fetish-heavy culture corrupting an entire generation? That's when otakus, once seen as harmless, passionate fans, started getting labeled as living proof of a supposed moral decline. This forced link between pop culture and youth violence lit the fuse for a debate that felt endless. Violent manga, guilty; video games, guilty; shy, introverted teens, guilty too. It was like anything that didn't follow the traditional mold became a target. And in the middle of this boiling pot, someone would emerge who would turn those fears into real horror. Tsutomu Miyazaki, later sensationally branded by the media as the Otaku Killer. But before we get to him, it's crucial to understand how fear took such deep root in the Japanese psyche. By the late 80s, Japan was caught in a wave of collective anxiety. As the otaku community grew and manga pushed boundaries like never before, society started to unravel. It wasn't uncommon to see harsh headlines in newspapers slamming underground comics and their so-called seeds of juvenile violence. A full-blown moral panic set in, a nationwide hysteria where any young person passionate about pop culture could be seen as a ticking time bomb. And of course, the media ran with it. TV shows, magazines, newspapers, every outlet jumped on the bandwagon, publishing stories that read like horror movie scripts. Otakus, the new threat, or violent manga turning teens into monsters. It was a constant barrage. For outsiders looking in, it was easy to buy into the idea that Japan was on the brink of being consumed by a generation of twisted, dangerous fans. And with every headline, the flames of public fear grew higher. That environment was a perfect storm, blending fetishism, isolation, and paranoia into something explosive. Shy teens who escaped into fantasy worlds started being viewed as potential freaks. It was as if liking anime or collecting action figures meant you had some kind of moral deformity. And before long, criminal investigations began digging for links between pop culture and deviant behavior, even if those connections were shaky at best, straight out of a conspiracy theory. This collective panic opened the door to a bitter national debate. Was underground manga and otaku culture to blame for violent crime and real-world horrors? The answer wasn't so clear-cut, but it only took one brutal case to seal public opinion. When Tsutomu Miyazaki, with his bizarre stash of horror VHS tapes and warped fetishes, was arrested, the media didn't hesitate. He was branded the Otaku Killer, the very monster they'd been warning about all along. And believe me, that was just the beginning. By that point, Japan was simmering with fear and suspicion. That's when the name Tsutomu Miyazaki started to rise from the shadows, linked to a string of crimes straight out of the most disturbing underground manga. The media, always eager to find a symbol of chaos, quickly labeled him the otaku killer, highlighting his sick obsession with horror comics and films. Suddenly, all of society's worst fears had a face. Miyazaki became the living embodiment of the twisted fantasies the public had grown terrified of. His mind seemed to blur the line between fiction and reality in horrifying ways, creating a world where grotesque acts made sense. For him, extreme violence and the suffering of children weren't just real. They were woven together with the imagery he consumed from horror mags and video. And with every chilling new detail that came to light, public panic only deepened, reinforcing the belief that otakus weren't just eccentric, they were a real danger to society. But before we can understand how he got to that point, we need to look at the life that shaped him. A background that sadly many people ignored at the time. Physical deformity, brutal bullying during childhood, extreme social isolation. All of it created the perfect breeding ground for violent fantasies to grow quietly beneath the surface. And when the only emotional bond he had, his grandfather, passed away, Miyazaki lost the last thread, keeping him even remotely connected to reality. What followed was a fast and brutal descent into barbarity. The story of Tsutomu Miyazaki isn't just about unimaginable crimes. It also lays bare the deep flaws in how Japanese society handled, and still struggles to handle, loneliness, fetishism, and mental health. Pop culture, underground manga, and the rise of otaku culture were used as convenient scapegoats, but the real root of the problem was far more complex and far more disturbing. And now, to truly grasp the horror of what he did, we need to walk through the timeline of his crimes, starting with his first victim, Mari Kono. The nickname Otaku Killer wasn't just some random label. Tsutomu Miyazaki, with his obsessive fixation on grotesque manga, violent anime, and horror films, seemed to embody every nightmare Japanese society had projected onto the otaku subculture. The media milked it for all it was worth, showing off his VHS collection, stacks of underground manga, and posters of anime girls in disturbing poses. It was like the country had finally found the monster it had long feared hiding in the shadows of pop culture. But what terrified people the most was how Miyazaki blurred the lines between fantasy and reality with no filter at all. In his crimes, he reenacted twisted rituals that could have come straight out of his favorite horror stories, abducting children, isolating them in remote locations, and committing acts of extreme violence. For him, each kidnapping wasn't just a crime, it was the physical realization of a warped script playing out in his mind. This brutal fusion of fiction and real-life horror poured more fuel onto an already raging fire over the media's influence on youth. The existing moral panic exploded. For many, the connection between pop culture and serial crime felt undeniable, like some kind of cursed prophecy coming true. Every newsstand, every TV show echoed the same chorus. This is what underground manga has brought us. That fear, stoked daily, sparked a witch hunt where even the most harmless otaku began to be seen as potential threats. It was the triumph of social fear over logic and reason. At his core, Miyazaki was more than just a product of eccentric hobbies. He was the result of years of emotional, social, and psychological neglect. But that, of course, didn't matter to a terrified public, hungry for simple answers. Behind the caricature of the otaku killer was a deeply broken human being, and his crimes were only the beginning of the trail of horror that would shock the entire country. And it all started with little Mari Kono. It began on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon in August of 1988. 4-year-old Mari Kono was playing peacefully outside her grandparents' house in a quiet town. In the blink of an eye, she vanished. Her family was thrown into panic, and soon a frantic search spread through the neighborhood. Anyone who's ever experienced the terror of a missing child, even for just a few minutes, knows how every second feels like an eternity. Police responded quickly, and it didn't take long before suspicions of something serious began to emerge. There were no signs of an accident or escape. Mari had disappeared into thin air. The search stretched on for days, but with every hour that passed and no news, the anxiety deepened. To make matters worse, rumors began to surface about child abductions in other regions, heightening public fear. A chilling sense that something very wrong was happening in Japan began to take hold. Weeks passed, and still no trace of Mari. Then her parents received an anonymous letter with a short but absolutely chilling message. There are demons out there. Just reading those words would send a cold shiver down anyone's spine. These letters and anonymous calls would soon become a twisted signature of the terror Miyazaki unleashed. It was as if he fed off the suffering of others, stretching the nightmare far beyond the crimes themselves. Marie Kono's case lit the fuse on a nationwide panic that had already been bubbling under the surface. Families started watching their children like hawks. Parks and playgrounds that once echoed with laughter fell silent. Fear was no longer just a vague feeling, it was real, tangible everywhere. And the worst part? Even the investigators couldn't have imagined that this was only the first chapter in a horrifying series yet to come. Not long after Mari's disappearance, another tragedy shook Japan even further. In October 1988, 7-year-old Masami Yoshizawa vanished while walking home from school. This time, the public reaction was immediate and intense. 2 children gone in such a short time, it couldn't be a coincidence. Authorities and citizens alike began to suspect they were facing a serial abductor. The pattern was chilling. Both disappearances happened in broad daylight, in supposedly safe areas. It sparked a wave of collective paranoia. Parents began picking their kids up from school personally, newspapers printed safety tips, and TV stations broadcast near-daily warnings. Social fear had become routine. People started eyeing strangers with suspicion, and debates about youth violence and pop culture were dominating conversations everywhere, from bar counters to talk show stages. But despite the growing urgency, the investigation was like a maze with no way out. There were no clear witnesses, no significant physical evidence. The police were flooded with tips, but most of them were just noise, echoes of the moral panic that had already consumed Japan. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack that was already on fire. Meanwhile, the dark figure of Tsutomu Miyazaki remained hidden in the shadows, quietly watching it all unfold, growing more confident with each passing day, convinced he would never be caught. With each new disappearance, the fear took on a life of its own, almost like a fetish. Sensationalist TV shows began speculating about connections to underground manga and otaku culture. It was as if the entire country was collectively asking, are our children becoming victims of the twisted fantasies we allowed to flourish? And sadly, the answer was beginning to look darker by the day. The tragedy was far from over. In December 1988, tension reached a breaking when 4-year-old Erika Namba vanished under circumstances eerily similar to the previous cases. This time, the tragedy didn't take long to confirm. Erika was found dead, strangled, and left roughly 30 miles from where she'd been taken. The news hit Japan like a bomb, exploding across a nation already drowning in fear and collective panic. Some witnesses reported seeing a suspicious man and an unfamiliar vehicle in the area that day. But the descriptions were vague, and the investigation once again failed to produce solid leads. Every dead end only deepened the public's sense of helplessness. It felt like the criminal, or criminals, were always 2 steps ahead, toying with the authorities in a cruel game of cat and mouse. This latest brutal crime pushed the public discourse to a whole new level. By now, the link between youth violence, underground manga, and otaku culture felt like a foregone conclusion for many. Letters and anonymous calls started pouring in, some real, many driven by mass hysteria, and of course the media ran wild with it, painting the image of the twisted otaku, isolated, fetish-driven, and lost in warped fantasies, a profile that lined up disturbingly well with Tsutomu Miyazaki. Erika's death etched fear deep into the Japanese psyche. Parks, schools, even stores began posting warnings about the danger lurking near children. Japan was no longer the same. It had become darker, more suspicious, more fragile, and in the shadows Miyazaki kept feeding his inner world of horror and violence, planning his next move. And the worst part? He still wasn't done. As the months passed, Miyazaki didn't stop at physical attacks. He started targeting the victims' families psychologically. The phone calls began. Chilling, anonymous calls that would make anyone's blood run cold. The person on the other end would either say nothing or whisper incomprehensible things. Some calls came in the middle of the night, waking desperate parents from their sleep. It was as if he fed off the terror he sowed, stretching the pain long after the crimes themselves. Then came the postcards, bizarre, unsettling notes with cryptic messages like, "The demon still walks," or "You'll never see her again." Each one was like a knife to the heart. It was a cruel psychological war, a new level of sadism that showed just how completely Miyazaki had detached from humanity. With each new letter, the social fear spread like an epidemic. The horror peaked when, months after Marie Kono's disappearance, her parents received a grotesque package, a box containing her remains, bone fragments and teeth, along with a mocking letter. Just imagine the devastating pain of opening something like that. It wasn't just a crime, it was an open declaration of war against all of Japanese society. This shock tactic planted seeds of fear and distrust that would rot entire households from the inside out. Meanwhile, police and the media were under immense pressure to find the person responsible. Criminal profilers scrambled to understand the monster behind these abductions and murders, but the trail Miyazaki left was as erratic as it was disturbing. The calls and letters made one thing crystal clear. This wasn't just a typical killer. This was someone who wanted to be seen, feared, and in some twisted way immortalized through collective terror. The impact of Miyazaki's actions wasn't limited to the victims' families. Soon, all of Japan was swept into a wave of hysteria. With the letters, the phone calls, the mailed remains, the media had the nightmare fuel it had been waiting for. Newspapers, radio, and television dove headfirst into the story, plastering the nation with images, speculative theories, and gruesome details. It was the birth of a full-blown media frenzy, where each new revelation cranked public fear up to dangerous levels. Late-night shows aired the disturbing messages received by grieving families, like episodes from a horror series. Photos of personal items, dramatic reenactments of the kidnappings, and wild guesses about the killer's methods saturated the public imagination. By now, almost every person in Japan knew the gory details, true or not. Fear had a face now, and it was that of a lonely otaku. This public outcry, fueled by the non-stop media coverage, forced the authorities into action. The pressure to catch the killer grew by the day, while public trust in the investigation started to collapse. At the same time, desperate measures began to appear. Safety pamphlets for parents, volunteer neighborhood patrols, and, of course, a silent witch hunt targeting any youth who showed signs of isolation or fetishistic behavior. If you were an otaku in the late 80s, every step you took was watched with suspicion. And of course, in such a volatile atmosphere, pop culture, especially underground manga, was dragged into the spotlight and placed on trial. Youth violence was now seen almost as an inevitable byproduct of otaku culture. A debate that had been simmering for years finally caught fire. Was manga to blame for creating monsters like the otaku killer? The answer was still far off, but public fear wasn't waiting for proof, and soon tragedy would take an even darker turn. In June 1989, horror reached new, grotesque heights with the disappearance of 5-year-old Ayako Nomoto. This time, the outcome was even more brutal. The little girl's body was found dismembered in a cemetery. The cruelty of the crime shook even the most seasoned investigators. This wasn't just the murder of a child. It was a scene deliberately constructed to shock, to terrify, to leave deep scars on the nation's collective memory. The investigation quickly revealed even more horrifying details. The killer had not only mutilated the body, but had consumed parts of it. That's right. Miyazaki had crossed a boundary most people couldn't even imagine. The partial act of cannibalism hit Japanese society like a bomb. This single detail supercharged the media's narrative. They now had the monster they'd warned about, a creature born from twisted pop culture, grotesque manga, and extreme social isolation. Ayako Nomoto's murder made it clear that the killer was completely unraveling, if he ever had control to begin with. It was as if the fetishes and warped fantasies that had festered inside his isolated world were now in full command. By this point, Japan wasn't just talking about crimes anymore. It was talking about a threat to the soul of the entire nation. Fear spread like poison through streets, schools, offices, and even within the most traditional families. And amid this absolute terror, one question haunted the public: how far could this monster go? If underground manga and otaku culture had supposedly created someone like Miyazaki, how many more were out there? Were there other Miyazakis lurking in the shadows? It was a disturbing thought, but one the country could no longer afford to ignore. And the end of this bloody story would start to take shape after one final failed abduction attempt. The end of the line for Tsutomu Miyazaki began in the most unexpected, yet symbolically perfect way. In July 1989, he attempted to abduct another child in broad daylight, but this time the plan went wrong. The child's grandfather noticed something off and stepped in immediately. Panicking, Miyazaki tried to flee. And it wasn't just a simple escape. He ran through the streets completely naked, in a scene so bizarre, it felt ripped straight out of one of his beloved underground manga. The arrest came quickly, and once he was in police custody, the true face of the otaku killer began to emerge. At first glance, he seemed like just another forgettable young man, quiet, unremarkable, almost harmless. But all it took was a basic search for the police to realize they were dealing with something far more sinister. Inside Miyazaki's room, they uncovered a grotesque collection, thousands of VHS tapes filled with horror movies, disturbing pornography, and deeply unsettling imagery. But it didn't stop there. They also found human remains, carefully preserved like trophies. It was the physical manifestation of his twisted fantasies, a perfect storm of youth violence, fetishism, and complete emotional detachment. Every new piece of evidence added fuel to the fire of national panic. Miyazaki wasn't just a killer anymore. He had become the living embodiment of the moral collapse many feared was being ushered in by Japan's youth culture. With the arrest, new debates exploded across the country. Did pop culture really create this monster? Or was Miyazaki the tragic product of trauma, rejection, and emotional neglect, a reflection of the parts of society no one wanted to confront? The answer wouldn't come easily. But one thing was clear: the impact of this case would echo for years, forever staining the image of otakus and reigniting a national conversation about media, violence, and youth like few cases in modern history. And yet, there was still so much left to uncover about who Tsutomu Miyazaki really was. Understanding Miyazaki requires more than just looking at his crimes. It means diving into the abyss of his personal history. From birth, his life was marked by exclusion. He was born with a rare deformity that prevented him from bending his wrists normally. For a child growing up in a culture as demanding and appearance-focused as Japan's, that kind of difference was a social death sentence. At school, he was a constant target, bullied, mocked, treated as something other, something to be avoided or laughed at. Over the years, Miyazaki withdrew deeper into his own world, cutting himself off from human connection and immersing himself in fantasy realms. That's where his imagination grew and where it began to warp. His inner world, shaped by rejection and rage, fed off the most extreme content he could find in underground manga and horror films. For most otakus, manga was a form of leisure. For Miyazaki, it was anesthesia. A key turning point in his life was the death of his grandfather, the only person he had a real emotional bond with. When he passed away, something inside Miyazaki snapped. He even kept some of his grandfather's ashes in a jar and would drink them mixed with water, believing it kept his presence alive. That moment was like a psychological trigger. That pushed him from fantasy into action, from imagining violence to carrying it out, all driven by a hollow sense of grief and abandonment. This complex psychological profile, marked by trauma, isolation, fetishism, and fantasy, was largely ignored by the media at the time. Most coverage chose instead to paint a shallow picture, the fanatical otaku who became a killer under the influence of pop culture. But the truth is far darker and much more uncomfortable. The Miyazaki case didn't just expose the danger of one disturbed individual. It exposed the failures of an entire society that didn't know how to care for or even recognize the signs of a looming mental collapse. When the Japanese press dubbed Tsutomu Miyazaki the otaku killer, they weren't just coining a shocking nickname, they were shaping the perception of an entire generation. The word otaku, which until then had simply referred to passionate fans of anime, manga, or technology, suddenly became loaded with stigma. Overnight, being into pop culture was associated with isolation, fetishism, and violent tendencies. The media crafted a perfect narrative, a deformed, lonely young man consuming underground manga filled with youth violence and bizarre sexuality. Miyazaki became the inevitable product of everything Japanese society feared, and at the same time, had silently tolerated. This oversimplified view completely ignored the human and psychological layers of the story, but it worked perfectly to fuel the already raging moral panic. And that explosion of fear had real consequences. Being an otaku became a source of shame for many young people. Specialty stores were forced to change their window displays. Anime conventions saw a drop in attendance. The debate over manga and youth behavior blew up, with politicians and academics calling for stricter censorship and tighter content regulation. Japanese pop culture, which had been flourishing as a form of creative expression, was suddenly seen as a threat to social order. In the end, the Tsutomu Miyazaki case served as an uncomfortable mirror for Japan. Instead of confronting the society's open wounds, bullying, emotional neglect, isolation, it was easier to blame the visible symptoms. The otaku killer wasn't just a monster shaped by his inner demons, he was also a dark reflection of a nation's collective failings. And that reflection would echo through Japanese culture for many years to come. Looking back at this entire story, it's impossible not to ask, how many times have we ignored the signs that someone close to us was drowning in loneliness or despair? How often do we choose to point fingers at what's visible, what's on the surface, and forget to look deeper where the real causes live? The otaku killer case reminds us that culture, entertainment, a person's passions, these are just the tip of the iceberg. So now I ask you, in your day-to-day life, have you been reaching out to those who need help, or just adding your voice to the chorus of judgment? What kind of society are we building with the values we choose to uphold? If this story moved you in any way, maybe it's time to rethink not just what we consume, but how we connect with the world around us. And if you're someone who wants to keep diving into stories that reveal deeper truths about human nature, stories that help you see beyond the obvious, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. That way, you won't miss any content that challenges the way you see the world. Your journey of reflection and transformation starts right now.